Hello, and welcome back to Bedtime Story. Before we begin tonight's tale, I'd love to know where you're listening from. If these stories have become part of your nightly routine, consider leaving a like and subscribing. It really helps the channel. Now get comfortable, settle in, take a deep, calming breath, and let's begin. In this new story, some mysteries begin with a disappearance. Others begin with an abandoned car, a missing person report, or something discovered deep in the woods. But the strangest stories are sometimes much quieter. They begin with small changes that almost nobody notices until those changes start forming a pattern. During August of 2021, residents of a secluded community in West Virginia began noticing something unusual along an old mountain road that had been partially abandoned for decades. At first, it seemed harmless. Someone was leaving small bundles of freshly cut wildflowers beside empty mailboxes after dark. Then the flowers began appearing outside occupied homes. By the end of the month, deputies had discovered that every house receiving them shared a connection nobody in the community had remembered for more than 50 years. The community sat in a narrow valley surrounded by forested mountains in southern West Virginia. Fewer than 300 people lived there permanently, and many families had occupied the same properties for generations. The main county road followed a creek through the valley before narrowing into an older route that climbed towards several abandoned coal settlements. Most structures beyond that point had disappeared beneath vegetation, although foundations, stone chimneys, and occasional mailboxes still remained beside the deteriorating road. Younger residents rarely traveled there. Older residents remembered when families had lived throughout those hills, but even they had little reason to visit anymore. The first flowers appeared on August 3rd beside a rusted mailbox nearly 2 miles beyond the final occupied house. A utility worker discovered them while inspecting damaged telephone lines after a thunderstorm. 6 small white flowers had been tied together with thin cotton string and placed carefully on top of the mailbox. The arrangement looked recent despite heavy rain the previous evening. The worker photographed it because the contrast between fresh flowers and the abandoned road seemed unusual. He assumed someone had visited an old family property and continued working. Nothing about the discovery suggested that anyone should contact authorities. 4 nights later, another bundle appeared farther down the mountain. This one rested on a mailbox belonging to a house abandoned since the late 1990s. The property owner lived in Ohio and rarely visited. A local hunter noticed the flowers shortly after sunrise and mentioned them at a nearby convenience store. The employee immediately remembered hearing about the earlier arrangement from the utility worker. Both bundles contained the same small white flowers tied with what appeared to be identical string. The coincidence became local conversation for several days before slowly being forgotten. Then the flowers reached an occupied property. Shortly before 7 on the morning of August 10th, 71-year-old Evelyn Carter stepped outside and found a small bundle resting beneath her mailbox. She had lived in the same house for more than 40 years and immediately assumed a neighbor had left them. Nobody admitted doing so. Her security camera covered the driveway, but not the roadside. Reviewing the overnight recording showed no vehicles entering the property and no unusual activity near the house. Evelyn brought the flowers inside and placed them in water. She later remembered that they had been tied with old-fashioned cotton thread rather than ribbon or modern twine. 2 mornings later, another occupied home received flowers. This time, the homeowner had a camera facing directly toward the road. Investigators would later examine the footage repeatedly. At 2:13 a.m., the mailbox was empty. The camera recorded normally for several hours. At 5:47 a.m., the flowers were suddenly visible on top of it. No person appeared between those times. No vehicle stopped. The camera had not lost power or restarted. Motion detection showed several passing animals and 1 distant vehicle, but nothing approached the mailbox closely enough to leave the arrangement. The homeowner contacted the county sheriff's office because the unexplained delivery felt more unsettling than threatening. A deputy collected the flowers and examined the roadside. The ground was still damp from recent rain, and the homeowner's footprints were clearly visible where he had walked from the house that morning. No additional human tracks could be identified near the mailbox. Tire impressions along the road belonged to ordinary traffic. The deputy found no note, symbol, or message attached to the flowers. With no evidence of criminal activity, he documented the incident and advised the family to continue monitoring their cameras. 3 nights passed quietly. Then another arrangement appeared. This one was discovered outside a vacant house, almost a mile farther south. Deputies were contacted immediately. By then, 5 properties had received nearly identical bundles. Investigators plotted their locations on a county map, expecting to find a simple geographical pattern. Instead, the sequence seemed irregular. Some houses were close together, while others were separated by more than a mile. Several properties had been abandoned for decades, others remained occupied. There appeared to be no obvious connection between the families, and the flowers themselves offered little evidence because the same species grew naturally throughout the region during late summer. The sheriff's office decided to treat the activity as possible harassment. Plainclothes deputies began driving through the valley after midnight, while additional trail cameras were hidden near several mailboxes. Residents were asked not to discuss camera locations publicly. Investigators believed whoever was leaving the flowers would eventually appear. The task seemed simple. The valley contained only a handful of roads, and reaching most properties required passing one of 2 monitored intersections. On August 17th, deputies received another call shortly after sunrise. Flowers had appeared outside an elderly man's home while he slept. A hidden trail camera had been positioned less than 30 feet from his mailbox. The memory card contained hundreds of photographs from the previous night. Deer crossed the road at 11:42 p.m. A raccoon appeared shortly after 1. A deputy's patrol vehicle passed at 3:06. At 4:18, the mailbox was empty. The next photograph was captured at 4:26. The flowers were already there. Nothing appeared in the 8-minute interval because the camera had detected no movement. Investigators initially suspected someone understood the camera's detection range and approached from behind. Testing showed that possibility was difficult, but not impossible. Dense vegetation covered the hillside above the mailbox, allowing someone determined enough to crawl through the brush without crossing the road. Deputies searched the slope and found no obvious trail. More importantly, poison ivy and thorny blackberry vines formed an almost continuous barrier behind the mailbox. Anyone passing through should have left broken vegetation or visible disturbance. None was found. The mystery might still have been dismissed as an elaborate prank if investigators had not noticed something about the elderly homeowner's family name. It also appeared on an old property map covering one of the abandoned coal settlements farther up the mountain. Curious, a deputy compared the other affected addresses with historical tax records stored at the county courthouse. Within several hours, investigators discovered the first meaningful connection. Every property where flowers had appeared had once belonged to a family living in the same mining settlement during the 1960s. The settlement had contained roughly 70 houses, a small company store, and a church before the mine closed. Families gradually moved away, and most buildings disappeared during the following decades. Some residents relocated only a few miles down the valley, others left West Virginia entirely. By 2021, almost nobody younger than 60 remembered the settlement's original layout. Yet the houses receiving flowers all belonged either to former residents or their direct descendants. Investigators contacted the County Historical Society, hoping someone could explain the connection. An 86-year-old former teacher recognized the names immediately. She had grown up near the settlement and remembered an annual tradition held during late August. Families placed wildflowers beside homes after someone in the community died during the previous year. The custom was not a funeral ceremony. It was simply a private mountain tradition acknowledging neighbors who were no longer present when summer ended. According to the teacher, the practice disappeared after the mine closed and families moved away. She had not seen anyone observe it since the early 1970s. That discovery changed the investigation. Deputies now believed the person leaving flowers might be an elderly former resident attempting to revive an old tradition. Historical records were reviewed to identify surviving families. Several people were interviewed, including former miners living in nearby counties. Everyone remembered some version of the custom, but nobody admitted placing the flowers. Most had not even realized anyone else still remembered it. Then, investigators noticed another detail. The flowers were not appearing randomly among descendants of former residents. They were following the original settlement's house numbers. Old mining company maps revealed that homes had once been numbered sequentially along the mountain road. The first mailbox where flowers appeared corresponded to the family that had occupied house number 11. The next belonged to descendants of house 12. Evelyn Carter's parents had lived in house 13. Every later delivery followed the same sequence. Whoever was leaving the flowers appeared to be moving through a neighborhood that no longer existed, one former household at a time. Investigators immediately checked which family had occupied the next numbered house. Records identified a residence that had belonged to the Dawson family. Their original mountain home had disappeared decades earlier, but one surviving daughter still lived approximately 4 miles away. Deputies contacted her and requested permission to monitor the property overnight. She agreed. 2 unmarked vehicles were positioned where officers could observe both ends of the road. A camera faced the mailbox continuously. Another monitored the rear of the property. Deputies arrived before midnight and remained in position until sunrise. Nothing unusual happened. No pedestrians approached. No unidentified vehicles entered the area. At 5:32 a.m., an officer walked past the mailbox during a routine check. It was empty. At 5:51, daylight began spreading across the valley. The homeowner stepped outside while deputies were preparing to leave. A small bundle of white flowers rested directly beneath her mailbox. The officers immediately reviewed their positions. Neither had seen anyone approach. The road camera showed the mailbox continuously throughout the relevant period. At 5:41, nothing was present. A passing truck briefly filled the camera frame at 5:43. Less than 2 seconds later, after the truck disappeared, the flowers could be seen beneath the mailbox. Investigators stopped the driver several miles away. He was a local construction worker traveling to an early shift. His dashboard camera showed him passing the property without slowing. No passenger was inside his vehicle, and nothing was thrown from either window. The flowers were collected for examination. They contained no fingerprints suitable for comparison. The cotton string appeared commercially available, but resembled products more commonly sold decades earlier. Botanical examination identified the flowers as white snake root collected recently from somewhere in the surrounding region. Nothing about them revealed who had picked them. Investigators now knew which family should receive the next arrangement. House number 18 on the historical map had belonged to a miner named Samuel Reed. Unlike previous families, however, researchers could find no surviving descendant still living nearby. Samuel, his wife, and their only son had moved away after the mine closed. Later records indicated that all 3 were deceased. Their former house site remained somewhere beyond the abandoned timber road. Deputies traveled there during daylight using the old company map. Almost nothing remained. The road had narrowed into a trail beneath trees, and thick vegetation covered most former home sites. After nearly an hour of searching, investigators located a collapsed stone foundation corresponding approximately with House 18. Beside it stood the remains of a concrete front step. There was no mailbox. On the morning of August 24th, a deputy returned to check the site. A bundle of white flowers rested on the concrete step. The discovery unsettled investigators more than the previous deliveries. Reaching the location required hiking almost a mile through overgrown terrain. Whoever had left the flowers knew exactly where a house demolished decades earlier had once stood. No obvious trail entered the foundation from another direction. Overnight, rain had softened several patches of exposed soil, yet deputies could not identify fresh footprints around the ruins. The sequence continued twice more during the final week of August. Flowers appeared at two former home sites deeper along the mountain. Investigators increased surveillance but never observed anyone leaving them. Then the pattern stopped. Historical maps provided a possible reason. The final arrangement corresponded with the last occupied house before the road reached the old mine entrance. There were no additional residences beyond it. Whoever had been following the original settlement's numbering system had reached the end. The sheriff's office eventually closed the investigation because no crime had occurred. Nothing was stolen or damaged. No resident had been threatened. The person responsible, assuming there was one, had simply left flowers beside properties connected to a community that had disappeared half a century earlier. Investigators never identified that person. For several years afterward, residents watched their mailboxes whenever August returned. The flowers never appeared again. Trail cameras recorded deer, bears, neighbors, delivery trucks, and countless empty nights. Nothing similar was reported anywhere else in the county. The old mining settlement continued disappearing beneath the forest until even some of the foundations became difficult to locate. Years later, the retired teacher who helped investigators understand the tradition was shown photographs of the flower arrangements. She studied them for several minutes before noticing something nobody had considered important. During her childhood, the flowers were never supposed to be placed outside every former home. They were left only for households that had lost someone since the previous August. Investigators returned to their list. Several of the families connected to the 2021 deliveries had experienced deaths during the previous 12 months. Others apparently had not. That initially seemed to disprove any connection with the old custom. Then, genealogical research uncovered deaths involving relatives who had moved to other states decades earlier. In every case, investigators could verify someone connected to that original household had died since the previous August. Some deaths had occurred hundreds of miles away and had never been announced locally. There was only one exception. The Dawson family, whose property deputies had watched throughout the night, had reported no recent death. Their surviving daughter was still alive when the flowers appeared beneath her mailbox. She remained healthy for several more months. Then, during the following spring, she died unexpectedly while visiting relatives outside West Virginia. Investigators never suggested the flowers predicted anything. There was no evidence supporting such a conclusion, and coincidence remained entirely possible. The case stayed closed. The surviving families eventually stopped discussing it, except when old neighbors gathered and remembered the mining settlement that once stood above the valley. What happened during those quiet August nights was never frightening in the way most mountain stories are frightening. Nobody heard footsteps outside a bedroom. No stranger appeared beside a dark highway. Nothing chased anyone through the forest. Someone simply remembered a forgotten community well enough to walk through it again, visiting houses that no longer existed and families scattered across generations. That is what made the story difficult to forget. Whoever carried those flowers knew where every household had once stood. They knew the order of homes along a road erased by 50 years of forest growth. They knew an obscure tradition that almost everyone had forgotten, and somehow they appeared to know which families had recently lost someone, even when those deaths happened far beyond the mountains of West Virginia. No one ever discovered who walked that old road during August of 2021. No one saw them arrive, and no camera ever clearly recorded them leaving a single flower. When the final bundle appeared at the end of the vanished settlement, the visit stopped forever. All that remained were photographs, several evidence bags, an old mining company map, and a question that never received an answer. Somewhere in those West Virginia mountains, somebody remembered people almost everyone else had forgotten. The mystery was why they remembered them so well. In this new story, long before GPS-guided drivers through the Appalachian Mountains, locals in southern West Virginia relied on narrow county roads connecting mining towns hidden between steep ridges. Many of those roads still exist today, winding through dense forests where abandoned coal camps slowly disappear beneath moss and vines. Most are perfectly safe during daylight. Yet, according to sheriff reports, volunteer search records, and decades of local newspaper archives, a handful of isolated locations continue attracting incidents that investigators have never fully explained. They are not officially closed. No warning signs tell visitors to stay away after sunset. Still, many longtime residents quietly agree on one thing. Some places in West Virginia should never be visited after dark. In late September of 2019, 41-year-old environmental consultant Rebecca Morgan traveled from Charleston to survey water quality near an abandoned mining watershed outside Fayette County. Her company specialized in restoring streams damaged by decades of coal production, and Rebecca had spent nearly 15 years working in remote sections of Appalachia without a single serious incident. Colleagues described her as careful, experienced, and unwilling to take unnecessary risks. Every survey followed the same routine: arrive before sunrise, complete inspections before evening, and avoid overnight work whenever possible. That schedule changed after unexpected equipment failures delayed the project until late afternoon. Rebecca considered spending the night in a nearby motel, but weather forecasts predicted heavy rain beginning before dawn. Waiting until morning would force another full day of delays and additional travel costs. Shortly after 6:30, she packed her equipment and began driving toward the final monitoring station located near an abandoned mining settlement known decades earlier as Red Hollow. The community had once housed more than 300 families before the last coal operation closed during the mid-1980s. Today, almost nothing remained except broken foundations, scattered utility poles, and a weathered church standing alone beside the road. Before leaving the county maintenance office, Rebecca mentioned her destination to an older road supervisor named Carl Jenkins. Carl had lived in Fayette County his entire life and recognized Red Hollow immediately. Instead of discussing road conditions, he asked Rebecca what time she expected to finish. When she answered that she hoped to leave shortly after sunset, Carl became unusually serious. He quietly suggested postponing the inspection until morning. Rebecca assumed the warning related to rough terrain or wildlife activity. Carl simply shook his head and replied, "The road is fine. It's what people keep reporting after dark that worries me." Before Rebecca could ask another question, another employee interrupted the conversation, and the subject was never mentioned again. The drive toward Red Hollow followed a narrow two-lane road climbing steadily into the surrounding mountains. Cell phone reception disappeared almost immediately after she left the highway. Thick hardwood forests blocked nearly every view beyond the next curve, while abandoned rail lines occasionally appeared beside the pavement before vanishing beneath overgrown vegetation. Rebecca had driven similar roads countless times and noticed nothing unusual during the first hour except how completely empty they seemed. She passed only 3 vehicles, all heading toward town. None traveled in the opposite direction after sunset. At exactly 8:14, according to the timestamp later recovered from her dashboard camera, Rebecca rounded a curve and noticed an old church standing beside the road. Its white paint had almost completely faded away, leaving weathered wooden walls barely visible beneath moonlight. One upstairs window glowed faintly as though someone had left a single lamp burning inside. Rebecca slowed briefly, surprised that anyone still maintained the building after so many years. She continued another mile before reaching the creek crossing marked on her survey map. When she checked the GPS coordinates, they did not match the location recorded by her company. Somehow, she remained nearly 3 miles from the monitoring station despite following the only road available. Assuming she had entered incorrect coordinates, Rebecca turned around. Less than 10 minutes later, she passed the same church again. This time, the front entrance stood partially open. No vehicles occupied the gravel parking lot, no lights shone from nearby homes. The glowing upstairs window remained exactly as before. Rebecca glanced at the dashboard clock and noticed only 4 minutes had passed since she first saw the building. The distance between the church and the creek crossing should have required nearly 10 minutes at her average speed. She stopped briefly on the shoulder, restarted her navigation system, and confirmed the route had not changed. As she continued driving, the road became strangely familiar. Every sharp bend, fallen tree, and damaged guardrail appeared exactly where she remembered seeing them only moments earlier. Then she noticed something even more unsettling. Fresh tire tracks covered the dusty shoulder ahead before ending abruptly beside an abandoned bus stop. There were no tracks leading away. Rebecca stepped out with a flashlight, expecting to find another vehicle hidden among the trees. The forest remained completely silent. Even the usual sounds of insects seemed to disappear. Moments later, her handheld radio emitted several seconds of heavy static before a calm male voice quietly said, "You're going the wrong way." The transmission ended before she could respond. Company records later confirmed nobody else was using that frequency within 50 miles. Rebecca returned to her truck and continued toward the monitoring station without stopping again. Nearly 15 minutes later, she finally reached the location marked on her survey documents. The water sampling equipment remained exactly where technicians had installed it months earlier. She completed the inspection in less than 20 minutes before beginning the return drive. To her surprise, the church had disappeared entirely. The road where it should have stood contained only an empty clearing surrounded by broken stone foundations. State historical records later confirmed a church had once existed there, but burned to the ground during 1993 after being struck by lightning. No rebuilding permits were ever issued. The following week, Rebecca casually described the experience while submitting her field report. Instead of dismissing the story, another environmental consultant admitted witnessing something similar nearly 8 years earlier. Curious, the company's safety manager searched archived incident logs and discovered 3 unrelated employees had reported navigation problems near Red Hollow after sunset over the previous 2 decades. None mentioned ghosts or paranormal activity, all described passing landmarks that later proved no longer existed. The company quietly updated its internal safety guidelines soon afterward. From that point forward, environmental surveys near abandoned mining communities in southern West Virginia would end before sunset whenever possible. The policy cited reduced visibility and remote terrain as the official reasons. Unofficially, several longtime employees believed the change came after too many experienced field workers returned, describing roads that somehow led through places history had already erased. To this day, local deputies continue responding to occasional calls from travelers, reporting strange navigation errors, missing stretches of time, or abandoned buildings appearing where official maps show nothing at all. None of the reports have produced evidence proving anything extraordinary occurred. Investigators continue attributing most incidents to fatigue, unfamiliar roads, or poor nighttime visibility. Yet among the people who have spent their entire lives in the mountains, one piece of advice survives generation after generation. If darkness falls while driving through the forgotten roads of southern West Virginia, and you suddenly recognize a place that should no longer exist, keep driving. Some places in West Virginia should never be visited after dark. In this news story, every year, thousands of hikers disappear into the forests of West Virginia, expecting nothing more than steep climbs, unpredictable weather, and long miles of quiet solitude. Most return with photographs, worn-out boots, and stories worth remembering. Search and rescue teams respond to dozens of incidents each season, nearly all involving injuries, wrong turns, or hikers underestimating the terrain. Those investigations usually end with relief rather than mystery. Every so often, however, experienced hikers walk out of the mountains carrying a story they refuse to explain in detail. They are not injured, they are not lost, and they never claim to have witnessed anything supernatural. Yet something happened during those hours in the wilderness that convinced them never to return. One such investigation began during the first week of October 2020. Inside Monongahela National Forest, after a group of 4 experienced hikers abruptly abandoned a weekend expedition they had planned for more than 6 months. The group consisted of 4 longtime friends from Charleston who regularly completed multi-day backpacking trips throughout the Appalachian region. Together, they had more than 30 years of hiking experience and extensive wilderness first aid training. Their route followed an isolated backcountry trail crossing nearly 18 miles of rugged mountain terrain before ending near a designated ranger access road. Weather forecasts predicted clear skies, light winds, and unusually mild autumn temperatures. Rangers later confirmed that trail conditions remained excellent throughout the week, making the trip one of the safest opportunities of the season. Nothing about the group's preparation suggested that the hike would end any differently from dozens they had successfully completed before. According to GPS records recovered later, the hikers reached their planned campsite shortly before sunset on the second day without encountering any unusual conditions. They prepared dinner, filtered water from a nearby stream, and contacted family members using a satellite messenger to confirm everything was proceeding according to schedule. That message became the final routine communication received from the group. Nearly 5 hours later, the same device transmitted an emergency assistance request that did not indicate injury or immediate danger, but urged rangers to reach their location as soon as daylight permitted. No additional explanation accompanied the signal beyond a short message stating that the group was leaving the campsite immediately. Search and rescue personnel located the hikers just after sunrise, walking steadily along the trail toward the nearest access road. Every member of the group appeared physically healthy. Medical evaluations found no dehydration, hypothermia, or signs of exhaustion. Their backpacks remained fully loaded with food, emergency supplies, and camping equipment. Rangers initially believed a family emergency had forced the hikers to end their trip early. Instead, each member insisted they no longer felt safe remaining in the area despite being unable to identify any direct threat. Because the decision seemed unusually abrupt for such experienced outdoorsmen, investigators conducted separate interviews before allowing the group to leave the ranger station. The interviews revealed remarkable consistency. Shortly after 1 o'clock that morning, all 4 hikers awoke independently after noticing that the surrounding forest had become completely silent. None recalled hearing a loud noise or specific disturbance beforehand. Instead, each described waking naturally before realizing something familiar had disappeared. The flowing creek beside the campsite could no longer be heard. Wind moving through nearby trees seemed to have stopped entirely. Even insects, which had remained active throughout the evening, had fallen silent. One hiker later estimated that several minutes passed before anyone inside the camp spoke because each assumed the others remained asleep. The silence itself became the first detail every witness remembered with absolute certainty. Investigators initially suspected changing weather conditions might explain the unusual atmosphere. Meteorological records, however, showed steady wind speeds throughout the night, with no sudden temperature changes capable of altering sound propagation significantly. Rangers familiar with the valley acknowledged that wildlife occasionally became quiet when predators moved through the area, but they emphasized that nearby streams would have remained clearly audible regardless of animal behavior. Audio specialists later examined recordings captured accidentally by one hiker's action camera. The analysis confirmed an extended period during which environmental sounds dropped to unusually low levels compared with recordings made earlier that same evening. Although specialists stopped short of calling the recording abnormal, they admitted the reduction remained difficult to explain using available environmental data alone. Moments after the silence began, one member of the group noticed movement along a distant ridgeline overlooking the campsite. The others later confirmed observing the same motion within seconds. None believed they had seen an animal because the movement remained unusually steady and continued across terrain that should have interrupted visibility several times. Rangers encouraged the hikers to estimate distance, size, and direction during separate interviews. While individual estimates varied slightly, every witness identified the same ridgeline nearly half a mile from camp. None attempted to approach the location. Instead, the group quietly packed essential equipment before deciding to leave as soon as daylight provided safe visibility along the trail. Later that afternoon, rangers returned to the campsite accompanied by wildlife officers and search specialists. The area showed no evidence of recent human activity beyond the hikers themselves. Fresh mud surrounding the tents preserved dozens of boot prints left while breaking camp, but revealed no unidentified footprints entering the site overnight. Wildlife tracks belonging to deer, black bears, and wild turkey appeared throughout the surrounding forest, yet none approached the immediate campsite during the relevant hours. Investigators climbed the ridgeline identified during witness interviews, hoping to locate signs of hikers, hunters, or illegal camps. They found nothing beyond dense forest stretching toward the next mountain valley. As part of the review, investigators examined earlier incident reports involving the same section of trail. Most involved routine rescues caused by injuries or navigational mistakes. 3 files, however, described experienced hikers voluntarily ending trips after reporting unexplained nighttime disturbances that could not be linked to weather, wildlife, or criminal activity. None of those earlier witnesses claimed to have encountered ghosts, unidentified creatures, or dangerous individuals. Instead, each described a growing sense that something in the surrounding environment had changed in a way they could neither identify nor comfortably ignore. Rangers noted the similarity, but cautioned that human perception in isolated wilderness can be influenced by countless natural factors that remain difficult to reconstruct after the fact. The investigation remained open for nearly 4 months, while environmental scientists, wildlife experts, and experienced search coordinators reviewed every available piece of evidence. GPS records confirmed the hikers never left the established trail. Medical examinations ruled out illness or environmental exposure. Satellite communications verified the timeline with remarkable precision. Despite that, investigators could not identify a single event explaining why 4 experienced backpackers unanimously abandoned a carefully planned expedition only hours after confidently reporting that everything was normal. The official report ultimately classified the incident as an unexplained precautionary evacuation with no evidence of criminal activity or continuing danger to the public. Today, the trail remains open and continues attracting thousands of visitors each year without incident. Rangers still recommend the route as one of the most scenic backcountry hikes in West Virginia. The 4 hikers involved have continued exploring wilderness areas across the country, proving that the experience did not end their passion for the outdoors. Yet, according to friends interviewed during the investigation, one subject is consistently avoided whenever old hiking trips are discussed. No member of the group willingly talks about the final night they spent on that mountain. They have never claimed to know what they saw, and investigators have never claimed to know either. All anyone can say with certainty is that 4 experienced hikers entered one of West Virginia's darkest trails, expecting an ordinary weekend in the wilderness. They left convinced that some experiences are better remembered than explained. The new house seemed perfect until we heard someone upstairs. Deep within the historic suburban neighborhoods of Savannah, a young married couple purchased their beautiful colonial dream home. During the humid autumn of 2020, they completely renovated the massive historic wooden structure very carefully. What actually happened during their very first night indoors completely defies any basic, logical, modern scientific explanation today. Archived notes from the subsequent state police investigation describe a highly disturbing timeline of terrifying late-night events. 32-year-old Liam worked as a highly dedicated structural architect designing complex commercial office buildings daily. His highly capable wife was a 30-year-old financial accountant named Chloe, who frequently worked remotely indoors. Their primary professional goal required them to quickly establish a quiet, comfortable domestic life away from noisy apartments. The county file from 2009 actually mentioned several highly unusual trespassing complaints regarding this exact property. They officially arrived on October 12th and immediately began carefully unpacking their heavy cardboard boxes in the parlor. The first quiet afternoon passed entirely without any significant dangerous incidents as the exhausted couple arranged their furniture. State records confirm the regional weather forecast predicted clear skies and dropping temperatures for that entire dark night. However, Chloe woke up shortly after midnight because she clearly heard strange, heavy footsteps echoing above their ceiling. She initially assumed a large, heavy animal was aggressively exploring the completely unfinished, dusty, wooden, dark, hidden attic. When she cautiously listened closer, the heavy, rhythmic footsteps instantly ceased completely in the cold, oppressive, silent house. Liam quickly discovered a highly bizarre, locked, heavy wooden door blocking the narrow hallway leading toward the stairs. The strange, unexplainable heavy door was perfectly solid, and it featured 3 massive modern steel deadbolts installed backwards. Some locals claimed a rogue, eccentric previous owner actively hid dangerous structural damage behind heavily reinforced wooden barricades. Investigators never confirmed those specific wild, unsubstantiated rumors and strictly maintained the property was entirely structurally safe generally. Liam carefully photographed the bizarre locked barricade and noted that the surrounding drywall showed extreme signs of stress. The highly stressful situation escalated drastically during that dark hour when an awful chemical smell suddenly arrived continuously. Reportedly, the foul, suffocating odor tightly resembled burning synthetic plastic mixed heavily with the sharp scent of sulfur. Both dedicated homeowners immediately started coughing violently and aggressively struggling to breathe properly inside their completely sealed bedroom. Liam quickly grabbed his portable emergency radio to call for immediate outside medical assistance, but only received static. Dispatch logs show no emergency distress calls were ever successfully officially recorded by the regional police department then. Suddenly, a massive, unseen, heavy physical force violently shook the solid foundation and violently rattled the thick windows. Liam scrambled frantically toward the dark hallway and desperately aimed his high-powered security flashlight toward the ceiling. The glowing beam instantly revealed an enormous, intense, dark mass standing perfectly still directly behind the stair banister. The strange, dark anomaly lacked any discernible biological features and completely blocked the normal, bright ambient light entirely. Records conflict regarding exactly how long they silently, terrifyingly watched the imposing tall anomaly before it slowly retreated. Chloe frantically, urgently insisted they absolutely needed to completely abandon their newly purchased historic home and run outside. Liam completely strongly agreed, but they soon realized the main electrical breaker panel was constantly displaying erratic sparks. They were effectively hopelessly trapped inside a massive, unforgiving structural maze known for permanently confusing, highly experienced contractors. The desperate, anxious architect decided to blindly, violently run toward the front door, hoping to retrieve his keys. He confidently, blindly sprinted continuously through the freezing dark living room until he eventually physically discovered the entrance. Liam remained entirely, completely, silently hidden behind the thick, solid wooden couch while intensely listening for aggressive movements. Archived notes from Liam stated he repeatedly caught brief, terrifying glimpses of pale, smooth, large objects moving swiftly. Every single time he abruptly, cautiously raised his head to firmly point out the hidden observer, they vanished. Utter physical, mental exhaustion eventually heavily forced him to quickly, carefully establish a completely vulnerable, unprotected defensive position. He huddled tightly, safely, against the heavy metal radiator while strongly clutching a heavy steel flashlight for protection. Around 2 in the freezing morning, the surrounding dark, dense house suddenly fell totally dead silent entirely, completely. A deep, guttural, mechanical humming sound slowly, continuously began to violently vibrate through the damp dirt beneath floorboards. Some locals claimed strange underground natural gas releases occasionally plagued the Savannah region, but geologists officially found nothing. Liam frantically aggressively scanned the pitch-black distant hallway with his heavy flashlight, but the expensive battery died. He silently screamed internally in absolute, sheer, unadulterated terror when a tall, pale, smooth shape casually stepped forward. The towering, featureless, pale entity did not overtly, aggressively attack the reinforced door, but simply stood motionless completely. Liam slowly, hesitantly gripped his heavy steel flashlight tightly, but his frozen, numb fingers were constantly heavily trembling. The bizarre, towering, unknown creature emitted another deep, deafening, humming vocalization that violently, instantly, completely shattered the windows. Plunged into total, suffocating, pitch-black darkness inside the house, the terrified young couple blindly, frantically crawled desperately. They hopelessly, blindly waited continuously inside the highly secure, locked basement room until the early morning sunlight arrived. A commercial utility repair operator miraculously happily found the rural property completely devastated near the heavily designated street. The highly traumatized young couple was severely, badly dehydrated and suffering from multiple minor bleeding lacerations from glass. State records confirm they were quickly, safely, immediately transported to a local regional medical hospital and strictly treated. When heavily armed local police deputies eventually carefully, safely navigated back to retrieve the abandoned property, they discovered chaos. The heavy, durable wooden interior doors were completely, entirely melted into toxic puddles and all metal hinges twisted. Liam was tragically completely unable to mentally process his terrifying experience despite the massive, highly coordinated psychological support. Highly trained tracking search dogs completely, entirely lost any distinct individual scent trails near the steep property edge. Law enforcement officials strongly, firmly suspected the blindly, quickly fleeing couple accidentally, entirely hallucinated the terrifying, massive entity. However, they absolutely could not logically, realistically explain how the heavy steel locks were completely melted by temperatures. The overwhelming, putrid atmospheric sulfur smell and the highly localized underground ground vibrations also strictly remained completely unsolved. Chloe completely, permanently, fully abandoned her promising financial accounting career and rapidly moved to a highly bustling city. She completely, absolutely, strictly refused to conduct any further public media interviews regarding her terrifying, unexplainable house experiences. She eventually, quietly, safely, wrote a highly obscure, completely anonymous internet blog detailing her intense, lingering, severe trauma. Reportedly, she deeply, severely suffered from chronic, daily, heavy insomnia and constant, terrifying nightmares featuring tall, smooth entities. Dispatch logs routinely, regularly show she frequently, frantically called local urban police authorities, continually complaining about heavy vibrations. The deep, dark, isolated suburban Savannah house remains mostly completely, thoroughly abandoned and deeply, heavily feared by residents. Experienced local rural real estate agents actively, aggressively, strictly discourage overly ambitious amateur novice buyers from exploring acreage. Official public state records conflict regarding the actual, total, highly accurate number of missing trespasser cases strictly linked. Some ambitious, independent, amateur internet investigators occasionally, dangerously, completely venture into the dark, unmarked house hoping for evidence. Most of them always safely return completely empty-handed, while a few others quickly emerge with unsettling stories. The absolute, total, complete lack of any definitive, hard physical evidence heavily, continually, profoundly frustrates those who believe. The completely destroyed internal security cameras conveniently, completely, permanently erased any potential digital visual proof of the entity. Vociferous internet online skeptics constantly, loudly, aggressively argue that sheer blind panic and total utter darkness easily transformed. Archived notes, carefully, thoroughly gathered from the official local police investigation, confidently, strictly concluded that an undocumented leak, yet the exact, highly specific, true physical origin nature of those massive, perfectly smooth, melted door frames remains. University, biology, science experts quickly, easily, permanently dismiss the crazy, ridiculous, bizarre idea of a completely unknown anomaly. They firmly, constantly, strongly argue that an active, healthy, massive biological population of large hidden creatures leaves evidence. No unusual biological organic hair samples or strange skeletal biological bone remains have ever been definitively positively linked. Some locals claimed the federal, national, centralized government quietly, aggressively, permanently suppressed the actual truth to protect operations. Investigators never confirmed any grand, illegal, hidden conspiracy and simply safely, permanently, officially closed the bizarre, terrifying case. In this new story, for more than a century, the mountains of West Virginia have challenged investigators in ways few other places have. Dense forests, abandoned mining roads, isolated valleys, and unpredictable weather have often complicated even the most straightforward investigations. Most missing hikers are eventually found. Most vehicle accidents are reconstructed. Most emergency calls end with reasonable explanations. Yet, every so often, a case emerges that refuses to fit within ordinary investigative methods. One such investigation began during the final weekend of September 2018, when a routine welfare check along an old fire tower road slowly transformed into one of the most perplexing unsolved cases ever handled by a rural sheriff's office. The investigation centered on Black Ridge, a heavily wooded mountain overlooking a small community in Pocahontas County. The ridge was accessible only by a narrow gravel road originally built decades earlier to service a now abandoned fire observation tower. Although hikers occasionally visited the summit during daylight hours, local residents rarely traveled the road after sunset because fallen trees, loose rock, and steep drop-offs made nighttime driving especially dangerous. On the evening of September 29th, a volunteer firefighter contacted the sheriff's office after noticing a blue station wagon parked beside the abandoned tower long after the surrounding recreation area had officially closed. The vehicle's headlights were off, yet its parking lights remained illuminated as though someone intended to return within a few minutes. Deputies arrived shortly before 11 o'clock, expecting to locate campers or photographers watching the stars from the summit. Instead, they found the station wagon completely empty. The keys remained in the ignition, the driver's wallet rested inside the center console, and a folded hiking map lay open across the passenger seat. The vehicle showed no signs of mechanical failure, recent collision damage, or forced entry. More unusually, investigators discovered a thermos of coffee that was still warm enough to suggest its owner had left the vehicle only a short time before deputies arrived. The surrounding silence seemed ordinary for a mountain after dark, yet the complete absence of any nearby person immediately raised concerns that the driver might have suffered a medical emergency somewhere along the ridge. Search teams assembled before midnight and began working outward from the abandoned vehicle. Experienced tracking dogs quickly identified a scent leading away from the parking area toward the remains of the old fire tower. Investigators followed the trail across a narrow footpath covered with fallen leaves before reaching the tower's concrete foundation, where the dogs unexpectedly stopped. Handlers attempted several restarts from different directions, but every effort ended at exactly the same location. Beyond the foundation, Neither dogs nor searchers located additional evidence indicating where the missing individual had gone. Fresh rain earlier that afternoon had softened the soil surrounding the summit, yet investigators found only one continuous set of footprints leading from the vehicle to the tower. No return tracks appeared anywhere nearby. At first daylight, the search expanded dramatically. State police helicopters equipped with thermal imaging scanned the surrounding mountains, while volunteer rescue teams divided the forest into carefully measured grid sections. Rangers familiar with the terrain searched abandoned logging trails, rock outcrops, and drainage channels where an injured hiker might have become trapped. Mine safety officials inspected several collapsed entrances located miles away, despite little evidence suggesting the missing person had traveled that far. By the end of the third day, more than 100 volunteers had searched nearly 2,000 acres without locating a single additional clue. The only confirmed evidence remained the station wagon, the footprints ending at the fire tower, and the unanswered question of why no trace continued beyond that point. Investigators soon identified the vehicle's owner as 51-year-old Thomas Granger, an amateur landscape photographer from Elkins who frequently spent weekends documenting remote Appalachian overlooks. Family members described him as meticulous, experienced outdoors, and deeply familiar with the region's mountain roads. Camera equipment recovered from the vehicle contained dozens of photographs taken throughout the afternoon, beginning with rivers, abandoned barns, and autumn forests, before ending with several images of the fire tower shortly before sunset. Nothing in the photographs suggested danger or unusual activity. Analysts carefully reviewed every image, enlarging reflections inside windows, shadows between trees, and distant ridgelines. No unidentified people, vehicles, or wildlife appeared in any frame. Digital evidence offered little additional guidance. Granger's mobile phone last connected to a nearby cellular tower at 8:47 p.m. before losing reception, an expected occurrence given the mountainous terrain. GPS information extracted from his camera confirmed he had remained near the summit throughout the evening. His credit cards showed no activity after purchasing fuel nearly 3 hours earlier, while bank records revealed no unusual financial transactions before his disappearance. Detectives considered the possibility that he had intentionally left the area on foot, but his backpack, flashlight, cold weather jacket, and overnight supplies all remained inside the vehicle. Friends later remarked that Granger never explored unfamiliar trails without carrying at least basic emergency equipment. On the sixth day of the investigation, a forestry employee made a discovery that briefly renewed hope. Less than half a mile from the abandoned fire tower, searchers located Granger's camera lens cap resting beside a moss-covered boulder overlooking a steep valley. The item showed no weather damage despite several days of rain, suggesting it had not been lying there since the initial search began. Detectives immediately returned to the area, expecting to uncover additional evidence. Intensive searches lasting another 48 hours produced nothing else. Forensic testing confirmed the lens cap belonged to Granger's camera, yet investigators could not determine how it reached a location that had already been searched repeatedly by trained personnel. Months later, after active search operations had concluded, detectives completed a final reconstruction of Granger's known movements. Every verified fact supported a simple timeline until the moment he left his vehicle. After that point, the evidence became increasingly difficult to reconcile. The footprints clearly demonstrated he walked toward the abandoned fire tower. The tracking dogs independently confirmed the same route. The photographs established that he had remained calm only minutes earlier. Yet no physical evidence explained how an experienced outdoorsman disappeared from an exposed mountain summit without leaving behind additional tracks, discarded equipment, signs of injury, or indications that another person had been present. The case remains officially open today as an unresolved missing person investigation. Every few years, advances in forensic technology prompt investigators to re-examine the physical evidence preserved from the original search, hoping overlooked details might finally connect the missing pieces of the timeline. So far, none have. Among retired deputies and volunteer rescuers who spent long days combing the forests of Black Ridge, the investigation is remembered not because of what they found, but because of what they never did. In a place where rain preserves footprints, experienced search teams rarely miss obvious evidence, and mountain trails usually tell a clear story. One ordinary autumn evening ended with a trail that simply stopped. For those who worked the case, that unfinished path remains one of the most haunting unsolved stories ever to emerge from the mountains of West Virginia. In this new story, the Carter family had lived in the same narrow Appalachian hollow for nearly 12 years before anything unusual ever happened. Their weathered farmhouse rested between steep forested ridges where sunlight disappeared long before evening reached nearby towns. Only 4 other homes stood within several miles, separated by winding gravel roads and dense hardwood forests that seemed to swallow every sound after sunset. The isolation had always been part of the appeal because the family preferred quiet lives away from crowded highways and expanding suburbs. Neighbors often described the hollow as peaceful, despite its reputation among older residents who quietly admitted they avoided walking those woods after dark. Spring arrived later than expected during that particular year. Cold mornings lingered well into April, leaving thick patches of fog trapped along the valley floor until midday. The Carter family continued their daily routines without noticing anything out of place. David worked maintenance at a nearby lumber mill, while his wife Karen managed the property and homeschooled their youngest daughter. Their older son often hunted turkey before sunrise, returning with stories about deer trails, black bears, and distant owls. Nothing in those conversations hinted that the family would soon become the subject of whispered discussions throughout neighboring communities. The first strange incident appeared so ordinary that nobody thought it deserved much attention. Shortly after midnight, one calm Tuesday, Karen woke because someone seemed to be slowly walking across the gravel driveway outside their bedroom window. The footsteps remained steady without rushing or hesitating. She assumed a neighbor needed help with a broken truck because emergencies sometimes happened in remote mountain communities. David pulled aside the curtain, expecting headlights or flashlights. Instead, he found only darkness stretching across the yard beneath a cloud-covered sky. The footsteps stopped the moment he looked outside, leaving complete silence behind. The following evening, everything remained perfectly normal until almost the exact same time. Again, the slow footsteps crossed the driveway. Again, they sounded close enough to identify individual stones shifting beneath heavy boots. David immediately stepped onto the porch carrying a flashlight. The beam reached the tree line without revealing anyone. Fresh dew covered the gravel, yet no footprints appeared anywhere across the driveway. The woods surrounding the farmhouse remained unusually still. Even insects seemed quieter than expected for that season, something David mentioned only after returning indoors. By the end of the week, every member of the family except the youngest daughter had heard the footsteps. Each person described the same deliberate pace. Nobody reported running, stumbling, or changing direction. Whatever produced the sound seemed to walk directly toward the front porch before stopping several feet short of the steps. Then, absolute silence followed. The family waited behind darkened windows several nights, hoping to catch whoever might be playing an elaborate prank. No figure ever appeared despite the unmistakable sound approaching the house with remarkable consistency. Weeks passed before another detail entered the story. Their closest neighbor, who lived almost 2 miles away, casually mentioned hearing someone walking outside his barn after midnight. He assumed raccoons had climbed across stored equipment until he noticed the sounds resembled measured human footsteps rather than animal movement. When David described similar experiences, the neighbor grew noticeably uncomfortable. He admitted older relatives once warned him never to investigate unexplained footsteps echoing through mountain hollows during unusually quiet nights. Those warnings came without explanations because previous generations rarely discussed such experiences openly. David dismissed the conversation as local folklore, even though the timing unsettled him. Rural Appalachian communities preserved countless stories passed through families for generations. Most involved cautionary tales meant to keep children away from abandoned mines, unstable cliffs, or unfamiliar strangers. He believed these newer rumors probably served the same purpose. Nevertheless, he installed brighter floodlights around the farmhouse and checked every window before sleeping. The lights illuminated nearly every corner of the property, making it difficult for anyone to approach unnoticed. Despite those changes, the footsteps continued exactly as before. Summer brought warmer temperatures and longer evenings. Friends visited for weekend cookouts, often staying well past sunset. Nothing unusual happened whenever guests remained outside. The strange sounds appeared only after everyone else had left and the family settled into bed. One visitor later remarked that the property felt unusually peaceful compared with neighboring valleys because almost no highway noise reached the hollow. Karen privately wondered whether that silence simply made ordinary nighttime sounds seem more disturbing. She tried convincing herself the explanation was psychological, yet every repeated incident chipped away at that confidence. One humid July night, the pattern unexpectedly changed. Instead of stopping near the porch, the footsteps slowly circled the entire farmhouse. Each family member listened while the unseen walker completed what sounded like a careful inspection around every exterior wall. Wooden boards occasionally creaked beneath invisible weight. Gravel shifted beside basement windows. Dry leaves rustled near the back entrance. David opened the rear door before the sounds reached that side of the house. Nothing stood beneath the floodlights except motionless trees swaying gently in the warm night air. Karen began recording dates and times inside a notebook. She hoped documenting each occurrence might reveal a logical pattern connected to weather, wildlife, or nearby activity. After several months, she noticed most incidents happened during calm evenings without strong wind or rain. The sounds almost never appeared during storms. They also seemed concentrated between midnight and 2 in the morning. Those observations fascinated David because they suggested consistency rather than random imagination. Still, neither explanation nor physical evidence emerged despite careful attention. In this new story, witnesses still can't explain these ghost encounters. In November of 2012, a remote forestry station near Greenwater, Washington, became the focus of an unresolved investigation. Local authorities received multiple contradictory statements from experienced wilderness professionals who encountered something they simply could not identify on the mountain. Mark Vance was a 34-year-old wildlife biologist who spent weeks tracking nocturnal animal populations across the dense Pacific Northwest Territory. He shared a temporary field cabin with Sarah Jenkins, a 28-year-old forestry technician who mapped severe trail erosion there. According to archive notes, their primary objective was purely scientific and required them to remain outdoors during late-night hours. The environment was notoriously challenging because thick fog frequently rolled through the valley, drastically reducing visibility for anyone in the woods. On the night of November 14, Mark set up motion-activated trail cameras along a deeply isolated ridgeline. Official dispatch logs later confirmed that his radio communication suddenly ceased at exactly 11:45 in the evening that night. Sarah remained at the base cabin, but reportedly noticed an unusual drop in voltage that caused all their electronics to flicker. She attempted to contact him several times, but the radio emitted nothing except a steady, high-pitched static sound instead. State records indicate that weather conditions were completely clear at the base station, which ruled out immediate storm interference entirely. Up on the ridge, Mark reportedly observed a dark silhouette standing completely motionless near one of his newly positioned cameras. He assumed it was a local hiker, so he called out a loud warning about the steep drop-off ahead of them. The figure did not respond to his voice, but it moved backward into the heavy brush with remarkable, silent speed. When Mark walked over to investigate the specific area, he found absolutely no footprints left behind in the damp mud. This detail was particularly baffling because the soil was very soft, meaning any human presence would definitely leave deep impressions. He recovered the camera unit and immediately returned to the base station to review the digital images with Sarah. The county file from 2009 detailed a similar incident where equipment failed, but these current photographs showed something else. The first 3 frames captured a completely blank trail, yet the 4th frame contained a bizarre, distorted visual anomaly. A pale shape was visible beneath the tree line, but its outlines were completely blurred due to unexplained light refraction. Investigators never confirmed if this distortion was caused by a faulty lens mechanism or an actual physical object passing by. Some locals claimed the area was historically prone to unusual magnetic variations that frequently disrupted electronic recording devices there. However, Sarah noticed that the temperature sensors on the camera logged an immediate drop of 20 degrees within 1 minute. The official regional weather data completely contradicted this finding, showing a perfectly stable climate across the entire mountain range. Records conflict regarding whether this brief localized freeze was an environmental anomaly or simply an instrumentation error by the team. The next morning, the 2 researchers decided to examine the ridge together during the clear daylight hours to find answers. They discovered that several heavy branches near the camera site were cleanly snapped off at a height of 8 feet. No heavy machinery operated in that protected zone, and wildlife officials confirmed no large animals matched that specific damage pattern. Furthermore, the broken wood fibers appeared completely dehydrated, which was highly unusual given the constant dampness of the rainforest. A nearby park ranger later filed an auxiliary report stating he heard low-frequency humming throughout the previous night. By the afternoon, the local sheriff department dispatched a single officer to conduct a routine check of the area. The responding deputy noted that both scientists seemed highly credible and showed no signs of panic or mutual deception. He searched the perimeter for evidence of unauthorized trespassers, but his search yielded absolutely no physical evidence of intruders. The official report concluded that an unknown animal or transient hiker likely caused the disturbance on the ridgeline. However, the file remains open today because several technical contradictions in the equipment logs were never fully explained by experts. Independent analysts don't agree on the actual source of the extreme temperature drops recorded by the field equipment. Some experts believe that a localized thermal inversion occurred, while others maintain that the digital sensor simply experienced a malfunction. We can't definitely prove either theory because the original camera unit was later lost during a routine transport to town. The case remains one of the most unusual mysteries in the region, leaving both witnesses without any clear answers. In this new story, in September of 2022, the West Virginia Association of Chiefs of Police hosted its annual investigative conference in Charleston. Among presentations covering homicide investigations, search and rescue operations, and digital forensics, one session attracted unusual attention despite involving no confirmed crime. The presentation examined a series of unexplained incidents reported over nearly 3 decades by residents of small mountain towns scattered across Appalachia. None of the cases resulted in arrests, none involved identifiable suspects, and none were officially classified as criminal investigations. What connected them was something far more unusual. In every case, experienced investigators concluded that the available evidence supported the witnesses' accounts far more than anyone had initially expected. The first file discussed during the conference originated in Clay County, West Virginia, during November 2016. Shortly after 6 o'clock on a cold Friday evening, the owner of a family-operated hardware store contacted local deputies after discovering the business unlocked despite having personally secured it less than an hour earlier. Nothing appeared to be missing. Cash remained inside the register, expensive power tools were untouched, and surveillance cameras continued recording normally throughout the evening. Deputies initially believed an employee had accidentally returned after closing. Instead, the surveillance footage showed the front door unlocking from the inside without anyone appearing on camera. Investigators reviewed the recording repeatedly, confirming there had been no interruption, digital corruption, or evidence of tampering. The door opened slowly, remained open for approximately 20 seconds, then closed again without a single person entering or leaving the building. Forensic technicians examined the property the following morning, expecting to identify a mechanical malfunction or signs of forced entry overlooked during the initial response. The electronic lock functioned perfectly during testing, fingerprints recovered from both door handles belonged exclusively to employees, and alarm records confirmed the security system had never been deactivated. More surprisingly, investigators determined that the locking mechanism could not physically disengage unless activated either from inside the building or through an authorized access code. The owner confirmed no employee possessed remote access, while security contractors verified that no system errors had been recorded that evening. The investigation concluded without identifying how the door had opened, leaving detectives with evidence that clearly documented the event but failed to explain it. The second investigation came from a small community in eastern Kentucky during August 2018 after volunteer firefighters responded to repeated reports of lights appearing inside a long-abandoned elementary school scheduled for demolition. Residents living nearby insisted the lights appeared only briefly before disappearing again, often after midnight when no authorized workers remained on the property. Responding firefighters entered the building expecting to find trespassers. Instead, they found every classroom empty, windows secured, and electrical service disconnected months earlier. Utility records later confirmed no power had reached the building since the previous winter. Investigators considered portable generators or battery-powered lighting, yet exhaustive searches recovered nothing capable of producing the illumination described by multiple witnesses over several consecutive nights. Unlike rumors that often circulate through small communities, the reports from the abandoned school came from individuals who had little connection to one another. Statements were collected independently from delivery drivers, overnight highway maintenance workers, neighboring homeowners, and a deputy sheriff patrolling the surrounding roads. Each described lights appearing behind second-floor classroom windows before disappearing moments later. Traffic cameras positioned several blocks away failed to capture the phenomenon because the building sat beyond their field of view, leaving investigators dependent upon witness testimony supported only by repeated, unsuccessful searches. After nearly 2 weeks, the reports stopped as suddenly as they had begun, and demolition crews removed the structure later that autumn without discovering evidence that anyone had been occupying the building. The final case examined during the conference began in a mountain town along the Virginia border during January 2020. County Emergency Dispatch received several calls reporting that church bells were ringing shortly after 3 o'clock on consecutive winter mornings, despite the church itself having been closed for nearly 6 months while undergoing structural repairs. Maintenance contractors confirmed that the bell tower's electrical controls had been disconnected during renovation work and remained inoperable throughout the project. Deputies responding to the church found locked entrances, undisturbed snow surrounding the building, and no indication that anyone had entered the property overnight. Audio specialists later inspected the bell mechanism, concluding that it could not have operated without electrical power or direct mechanical force. No evidence supporting either explanation was ever found. Investigators reviewing the 3 incidents several years later noted that each initially appeared simple enough to resolve within hours. An unlocked store suggested burglary. Lights inside an abandoned school suggested trespassing, Church bells ringing before dawn suggested vandalism. Yet, every investigation gradually moved away from those ordinary assumptions as physical evidence refused to support them. Surveillance systems functioned correctly, forensic examinations revealed no signs of criminal activity, and independent witness statements remained remarkably consistent throughout each inquiry. Rather than producing dramatic conclusions, investigators repeatedly found themselves eliminating one practical explanation after another until only the documented facts remained. During the conference discussion, veteran detectives emphasized an important distinction often overlooked by the public. None of the official case files described paranormal events, and none encouraged supernatural conclusions. Instead, the reports documented situations in which observable events occurred without leaving sufficient evidence to identify a conventional cause. Experienced investigators considered that distinction essential because unresolved cases demand caution rather than speculation. Even so, many acknowledged that these incidents remained memorable precisely because they resisted ordinary investigative methods despite careful documentation and extensive follow-up. Today, the three files remain archived within their respective county agencies, each carrying administrative classifications that simply identify the investigations as closed without resolution. The communities where the incidents occurred have largely returned to ordinary life, with new businesses replacing old storefronts, schools giving way to vacant lots, and church renovations long since completed. Yet among retired deputies, volunteer firefighters, and investigators who personally worked those cases, the stories continue to surface during conversations about the investigations that proved the most difficult to forget. Not because they revealed something supernatural, but because they demonstrated that even in the quietest Appalachian mountain towns, there are still cases where every available fact can be verified, every witness can be believed, and the truth can remain permanently out of reach. In this new story, on July 26, 2019, emergency responders were dispatched to a narrow stretch of State Route 16 in southern West Virginia after several passing motorists reported finding an abandoned pickup truck resting against a roadside guardrail. The collision itself appeared minor. The airbags had not deployed, the windshield remained intact, and investigators found no evidence suggesting another vehicle had been involved. What immediately concerned deputies was the complete absence of the driver. The truck's engine was still warm when the first deputy arrived, the headlights remained on, and the driver's wallet, cell phone, and vehicle keys were all found inside the cab. Under ordinary circumstances, investigators expected to locate the driver somewhere nearby within a matter of minutes. Instead, the search developed into one of the most unusual missing person investigations the county had handled in years. The truck belonged to 43-year-old Michael Turner, an electrical contractor from Beckley who had spent the afternoon inspecting power equipment at several rural substations following severe summer storms earlier that week. Company records confirmed he completed his final inspection shortly after 8 o'clock before beginning the 70-minute drive home. GPS records taken from his work tablet showed nothing unusual during most of the journey. He stopped briefly at a gas station, purchased coffee, and continued north along the same highway he had driven dozens of times before. Security cameras showed him leaving alone. Nothing in his behavior suggested confusion, distress, or any intention of changing his route. Deputies began searching the immediate area under the assumption that Turner had been injured and wandered into the surrounding woods seeking help. Volunteer firefighters, tracking teams, thermal imaging drones, and canine units spent the remainder of the night examining nearly 3 miles of steep forest surrounding the crash site. Fresh tire marks confirmed the pickup had gradually drifted onto the shoulder before striking the guardrail at relatively low speed. There were no signs of sudden braking, evasive steering, or mechanical failure. More puzzling still, investigators found only a single set of footprints leading away from the driver's door. Those tracks continued for approximately 80 yards before ending abruptly on a patch of exposed rock where tracking dogs lost the scent entirely. During the following morning, Accident reconstruction specialists examined the vehicle in greater detail. They found no evidence of intoxication, medical distress, or equipment failure. The truck contained unopened groceries, work documents neatly organized on the passenger seat, and a cooler holding medication Turner was expected to take that evening. His wedding ring remained on the center console after he had apparently removed it while working earlier that day, a habit his wife later confirmed. Everything inside the truck suggested a man expecting to arrive home within the hour. Nothing suggested someone preparing to disappear voluntarily. Investigators next focused on Turner's digital activity. His mobile phone had stopped transmitting only moments before deputies arrived, but technicians recovered location data covering the final 30 minutes of his drive. The information revealed something unexpected. Although the truck had remained on State Route 16, the phone's internal compass repeatedly registered abrupt directional changes inconsistent with the road itself. Analysts initially suspected a software error until identical anomalies appeared in data collected from Turner's dashboard navigation system. Whatever caused the irregular readings affected two independent devices operating through different sensors. Engineers were unable to reproduce the malfunction during later testing. As search operations expanded, detectives interviewed motorists who had driven the same stretch of highway that evening. Most remembered nothing unusual beyond the abandoned pickup. One witness, however, provided a timeline that complicated the investigation. Traveling approximately 15 minutes behind Turner, she recalled passing the same white pickup twice within less than 10 minutes, despite remaining on the same road without making any turns. Investigators verified her route using toll records and fuel receipts. According to every available record, she could not have encountered the same vehicle twice unless one of the two timelines was incorrect. Yet, surveillance footage from a convenience store confirmed the time she entered the highway matched her statement almost exactly. State police analysts reviewed traffic cameras from neighboring counties, hoping to establish Turner's complete route. Every camera showed the pickup exactly where investigators expected until the final 12-mile section approaching the crash site. No cameras covered that stretch of road directly, leaving investigators to reconstruct events using witness statements, digital records, and estimated travel times. The resulting timeline contained an unexplained gap of nearly 26 minutes. Based on the distance involved, Turner should have reached the crash location long before emergency calls were placed. No evidence explained where he had been during those missing minutes. Search teams remained in the area for 12 consecutive days. Helicopters equipped with infrared cameras surveyed nearby ridgelines, dive teams searched ponds and abandoned quarry pits. Hundreds of volunteers walked carefully spaced grid patterns across dense woodland. Despite covering more than 1,800 acres, investigators recovered nothing beyond the original footprints ending on exposed stone. The absence of additional physical evidence gradually shifted attention away from the surrounding forest and toward the unanswered questions contained within the timeline itself. Several months later, forensic analysts completed a detailed examination of the pickup's onboard computer. Among thousands of ordinary vehicle records, technicians discovered that every electronic system inside the truck had briefly lost synchronized time shortly before the collision. The discrepancy lasted only 43 seconds before correcting automatically. Individually, such errors occasionally occurred in modern vehicles. What attracted investigators' attention was that Turner's phone, work tablet, and dashboard navigation system all recorded nearly the same unexplained interruption within the same minute. Specialists from both the vehicle manufacturer and the software companies involved agreed on only one point. They had never encountered identical timing anomalies across 4 independent electronic systems operating simultaneously. The investigation officially remains open. Michael Turner has never been located, and no evidence has emerged indicating he intentionally disappeared or became the victim of a known crime. His truck still sits inside a secured evidence facility, preserved because investigators believe advances in digital forensics may someday explain details that current technology cannot. The official case file concludes with a straightforward assessment stating that the available evidence is insufficient to determine what occurred during the final half hour of Turner's journey. For the detectives who worked the investigation, however, the unanswered questions begin much earlier than the crash itself. They begin with the missing 26 minutes, a routine drive home, and one of the darkest July nights the county has ever tried to explain. In this new story, when investigators review emergency calls from the Appalachian Mountains, they quickly discover that the most unusual reports rarely involve violent crimes or major disasters. Instead, many begin with ordinary people describing something that simply did not make sense. A driver refuses to leave a vehicle after seeing someone standing beside an empty road. A family abandons a campsite before sunrise without taking their belongings. A veteran hunter suddenly turns around after spending decades walking the same trails. Most of those incidents are eventually explained through weather, wildlife, or simple misunderstanding. Others remain preserved inside county files because every practical explanation failed to account for the evidence. One such investigation began during the final week of July 2019 in a remote section of eastern Tennessee, where several unrelated travelers reported the same disturbing encounter after driving through the mountains long after dark. The reports all centered on Hollow Creek Road, a narrow two-lane highway winding through dense forest less than 15 miles from the Tennessee-North Carolina border. During daylight hours, the route was popular with hikers and anglers traveling toward nearby public lands. After sunset, however, traffic dropped dramatically. The road contained long stretches without homes, businesses, or reliable cellular service. Local deputies routinely patrolled the area because stranded motorists occasionally required assistance after hitting wildlife or suffering mechanical problems. Serious criminal activity remained rare, making the sudden increase in emergency calls during one particular week immediately stand out to investigators reviewing dispatch records. The first report came from a retired couple returning home after visiting relatives. Shortly before 11 o'clock, they contacted emergency dispatch after noticing a person standing beside the road near an abandoned wooden bridge. According to their statement, the individual appeared to be wearing dark clothing and remained completely still as their vehicle approached. Concerned that someone might have been injured or attempting to flag down passing traffic, the driver slowed to offer assistance. Before the vehicle reached the bridge, however, the figure disappeared behind the guardrail without crossing the road or entering the surrounding forest. Believing the person might have fallen down the steep embankment, the couple immediately contacted authorities. A deputy arrived less than 15 minutes later and searched both sides of the bridge using high-powered flashlights. Fresh rain earlier that evening had softened the muddy ground surrounding the roadside, creating excellent conditions for preserving footprints. Investigators found no tire tracks, footprints, or signs that anyone had recently climbed the embankment. The creek below remained shallow enough that an injured person could not have been carried away by the current. After completing a thorough search, the deputy concluded that the witnesses had probably mistaken a tree stump or roadside marker for a person while driving through darkness. The report was filed without further investigation. 2 nights later, dispatch received another call involving the exact same location. This time, the witness was an experienced commercial truck driver transporting livestock across the state. Unlike the previous callers, he carried a continuously recording dashboard camera. According to his report, he noticed what appeared to be a person standing beside the bridge long before reaching the location because the reflective stripes on the figure's clothing briefly caught his headlights. Expecting someone to wave for help, he reduced speed while preparing to stop. Instead, the figure remained motionless until the truck rounded the final curve. At that point, it disappeared from view. The driver immediately checked both side mirrors, expecting to see someone walking along the shoulder. The road behind him remained completely empty. Investigators obtained the dashboard camera footage, hoping it would identify the individual. The recording confirmed that the driver slowed significantly while approaching the bridge. It also showed a faint upright shape near the roadside, lasting only a fraction of a second before disappearing behind the truck's headlights. Image specialists enhanced the footage repeatedly, but could not determine whether the object represented a person, vegetation, or a brief lighting distortion caused by moisture on the camera lens. The video neither confirmed nor disproved the driver's statement, leaving detectives with evidence that raised more questions than answers. The investigation expanded after 3 additional motorists reported remarkably similar experiences during the following week. None of the witnesses knew one another, and each contacted emergency dispatch before local media became aware of the earlier reports. Every statement described the same section of Hollow Creek Road. Every witness believed they had seen someone standing beside the abandoned bridge. Every search conducted immediately afterward found nothing. Detectives carefully compared timelines, weather conditions, traffic volume, and witness backgrounds, expecting to identify a common factor linking the reports. The only consistent element remained the location itself. Rather than increasing routine patrols, the sheriff assigned 2 deputies to remain hidden near the bridge during several consecutive nights. Their objective was simple. If someone was deliberately frightening motorists, officers intended to intercept the individual before another emergency call occurred. The deputies positioned their vehicles well away from the highway and monitored the bridge using night vision equipment. Hours passed without incident. Shortly before midnight on the 3rd night, one deputy observed a vehicle suddenly slowing as it approached the bridge before accelerating away moments later. Dispatch immediately received another call from the driver reporting a person standing beside the roadway. The deputies reached the exact location in less than 40 seconds. Once again, nobody was there. Following that incident, engineers from the Tennessee Department of Transportation inspected the roadway, searching for reflective signs, damaged guardrails, unusual shadows, or roadside objects capable of creating the illusion of a standing person under certain lighting conditions. Surveyors mapped every tree, utility pole, and roadside marker visible from approaching vehicles. Computer simulations using identical vehicle headlights failed to recreate the appearance consistently described by witnesses. Although several combinations of shadows briefly resembled human shapes, none matched the reported height, position, or timing documented throughout the investigation. Detectives reluctantly ruled out the possibility that every witness had experienced the same optical illusion. As investigators reviewed older county archives, they discovered something unexpected. Nearly 23 years earlier, highway maintenance supervisors had submitted several reports describing motorists stopping along the same bridge after believing someone had been standing beside the road. Those reports contained no mention of ghost stories, local legends, or supernatural explanations. Instead, maintenance crews requested additional warning signs because drivers repeatedly braked unexpectedly while passing through the area after dark. The request was eventually denied after engineers failed to identify any roadway hazard requiring corrective action. The documents were quietly archived and forgotten until the current investigation brought them to light decades later. The sheriff officially closed the case after 6 weeks without identifying a suspect, uncovering evidence of criminal activity, or documenting additional reports. No missing persons were connected to the location, and no witnesses ever claimed the figure attempted to approach their vehicles or communicate with them. Detectives deliberately avoided labeling the incident as paranormal, concluding only that repeated witness observations could not be explained using the available evidence. Even today, Hollow Creek Road remains open to public traffic, carrying thousands of vehicles every year without incident. Yet, among local deputies who worked the investigation, one memory has endured. Every driver who reported the mysterious figure described the same reaction before contacting emergency dispatch. None believed they had encountered a ghost. Every one of them believed they had seen an ordinary person who desperately needed help. That simple assumption was exactly what brought them back to the bridge, and exactly what they could never explain. In this new story, there are summer nights in Appalachia that people remember for ordinary reasons. The smell of rain on warm pavement, insects singing beyond open windows, and porch lights glowing beneath trees become part of childhood and family memory. But during August of 2018, residents of a small mountain community in eastern Kentucky began remembering their nights for something entirely different. It started with a sound heard far beyond the last occupied houses, somewhere along an old road climbing into the forest. Within 3 weeks, people were sleeping with their windows closed despite the summer heat, dogs were being brought indoors before sunset, and several families had temporarily left the valley. Nothing was ever officially declared dangerous. Nobody disappeared. Yet years later, those who lived there still remember exactly when the strange sound first came down from the mountain. The community stretched along a narrow valley containing fewer than 60 homes, many occupied by families who had lived there for generations. Beyond the northern edge of the settlement, the paved road became gravel before climbing toward abandoned timberland owned by several private companies. Logging operations had ended decades earlier, leaving miles of deteriorating access roads slowly disappearing beneath vegetation. Hunters occasionally traveled into the area during autumn, but August was normally quiet. There were no campgrounds, hiking destinations, or occupied buildings beyond the final house. After sunset, almost no reason existed for anyone to travel farther into the mountains. The first incident occurred shortly after midnight on August 6th. A retired mechanic named Harold Bennett was sitting beside an open bedroom window when he heard what sounded like a vehicle approaching from somewhere above the valley. At first, he assumed a pickup truck was descending the old logging road. The noise resembled an engine operating at low speed, disappearing occasionally behind the ridges before returning several seconds later. Harold waited for headlights to appear through the trees. None did. The sound continued for nearly 10 minutes before stopping somewhere beyond the abandoned timber gate. He thought little about it until his neighbor mentioned hearing exactly the same thing the following morning. 3 nights later, the sound returned. This time, at least 7 households heard it. Residents described a low mechanical rumble moving gradually down the mountain shortly after 1 in the morning. Several people stepped onto their porches expecting to see a truck approaching. Instead, the gravel road remained completely dark. The noise became louder for several minutes before suddenly stopping. No headlights appeared, no vehicle entered the community. One resident drove toward the timber gate after daylight and found it secured with a heavy chain that appeared covered in rust. Vegetation had grown across the road behind it, making recent vehicle traffic seem unlikely. The reports might have remained neighborhood conversation if the sound had not returned on August 12th while a county deputy happened to be nearby. Shortly after 1:20 a.m., dispatch received 3 calls within minutes. The deputy drove toward the northern end of the valley and stopped approximately half a mile from the timber gate. According to his incident report, he could hear something resembling a heavy engine operating beyond the ridge. The sound was distant, but distinct enough that he initially suspected unauthorized logging equipment. He waited beside the road, expecting the vehicle to descend toward him. After approximately 4 minutes, the sound disappeared. The deputy inspected the gate using his flashlight. The chain remained locked, and thick weeds covered both tire paths beyond it. No fresh tracks appeared in the gravel leading toward the mountain. He contacted the timber company the following morning and learned that no employees had entered the property for more than 2 months. The company also confirmed that heavy equipment had been removed years earlier from the section of forest overlooking the valley. A representative inspected the road later that week and found no evidence that any vehicle had recently passed the gate. Then the pattern changed. On August 15th, residents heard the mechanical rumble shortly before midnight, but it no longer seemed confined to the mountain. Several families believed the sound had reached the gravel road below the gate. A woman living near the northern end of the community noticed her dogs becoming restless several minutes before she heard it. Both animals moved away from the front porch and remained near the back door until the noise stopped. Across the road, another resident turned on exterior floodlights, expecting to reveal a vehicle approaching through the darkness. The road remained empty. The sound continued anyway. Over the next several nights, deputies began patrolling the valley more frequently. They considered illegal logging, off-road vehicles, mining equipment, and even machinery operating in another valley whose sound might have traveled unusually through the mountains. Weather records were examined because temperature inversions sometimes carry distant sounds much farther than expected. That possibility seemed promising until investigators contacted businesses and landowners throughout the surrounding area. No heavy machinery had been operating during the reported hours. Even if distant equipment explained the sound itself, it could not easily explain why multiple residents consistently believed it was moving along the same abandoned road. The most disturbing incident occurred during the early morning hours of August 19th. Shortly after 2 o'clock, a family living 3 houses below the timber gate woke when their motion-sensitive driveway light activated. Seconds later, they heard the familiar low rumble outside. Curtains prevented them from seeing the driveway clearly, but the sound seemed close enough that they expected a truck to be parked beside the house. They remained inside and contacted dispatch. While waiting for deputies, another motion light activated farther down the driveway. Then another illuminated near the roadside. The lights appeared to be responding sequentially to something moving away from the house. Deputies arrived less than 8 minutes later. They found no vehicle and no person anywhere along the road. The driveway consisted partly of loose gravel that normally preserved obvious tire impressions, yet investigators discovered no fresh tracks beyond those belonging to the homeowners. The motion sensors were tested repeatedly and worked correctly. Small animals occasionally triggered them, but investigators could not reproduce the exact sequence described by the family without physically walking from the house toward the road. Nothing had been captured because the property had motion lighting, but no security cameras. After that night, several residents installed inexpensive trail cameras facing the road. Others borrowed cameras normally used during hunting season and positioned them near driveways. The community hoped that whatever was traveling through the valley would finally be recorded. For 3 nights, nothing happened. The forest returned to its familiar August rhythm, and some residents began believing the strange sequence had ended. Then, shortly after 1:40 a.m., on August 23rd, the rumble returned, louder than anyone remembered. Multiple cameras activated within a period of roughly 6 minutes. The first belonged to a house nearest the abandoned timber road. Several minutes later, another camera triggered nearly half a mile south. A third activated farther down the valley. By morning, residents expected the recordings to show a truck traveling through the community. Instead, every image showed an empty road. There were no headlights, people, or animals visible in any frame, yet the timestamps created an unmistakable progression moving south through the valley at approximately the speed of a slowly driven vehicle. Investigators collected copies of the photographs and examined the camera settings. The devices were manufactured by different companies and belonged to unrelated households. Each had been positioned independently. Equipment malfunction could explain an isolated activation, but coordinated failures occurring sequentially along several miles of road seemed far less likely. Wildlife remained another possibility, although nothing appeared in the photographs. A small animal moving outside the camera's visible range could theoretically trigger some sensors, but investigators could not explain why the activations followed the road in an orderly sequence. Then, something happened that changed the atmosphere throughout the community. The final camera activated beside an abandoned church near the southern end of the valley. The church had closed more than 15 years earlier, and its gravel parking area was gradually disappearing beneath weeds. The camera captured 3 photographs. The first showed the empty road. The second, taken several seconds later, showed the same scene. The third contained a faint pair of white points near the far edge of the frame. Investigators initially assumed they were reflections from an animal's eyes. When wildlife specialists examined the image, they could not confidently determine what had produced them. The following morning, 2 residents walked behind the abandoned church searching for tracks. They discovered nothing unusual until reaching an old access road almost completely hidden beneath vegetation. Older residents remembered that the road had once connected the church property with a small cemetery farther into the woods. Nobody had maintained it for decades. The men followed it for approximately a quarter mile before finding something neither expected. Fresh parallel impressions crossed a muddy section of the old road. They resembled vehicle tire tracks. Deputies photographed and measured the impressions that afternoon. The tracks continued for less than 60 yards before reaching rocky ground where they disappeared. Investigators followed the abandoned road in both directions but found no vehicle. The northern end eventually connected with another forgotten logging route climbing toward the same timberland where the strange sounds had first been reported. Historical maps confirmed that decades earlier, the 2 roads had formed a continuous route through the mountains. Most of that route was now impassable because of fallen trees, erosion, and vegetation. Investigators walked several sections and concluded that an ordinary vehicle could not have traveled the entire distance without leaving extensive evidence. Local interest increased, but the sheriff's office avoided encouraging rumors. Deputies reminded residents that unexplained sounds in mountainous terrain could have natural causes and that old roads sometimes preserved impressions that appeared more recent than they actually were. No evidence indicated that anyone in the community faced immediate danger. Patrols continued anyway. Residents kept their cameras operating. Families who normally slept with windows open began closing them after dark. Nobody wanted to admit being frightened by something they had never actually seen. On August 26th, the sound returned for the final time. It began shortly after 2:30 in the morning near the northern ridge. Residents woke as it moved gradually toward the valley. Trail cameras activated in nearly the same order as before. This time, several homeowners were already watching from darkened windows. They heard what seemed unmistakably like a vehicle approaching. Some even believed they could distinguish tires moving across loose gravel beneath the deeper mechanical rumble. Yet, the road remained empty. The sound traveled past the abandoned church and continued south toward the highway. A deputy waiting near the intersection heard it approaching from several hundred yards away. His patrol camera recorded him stepping from the vehicle and looking north along the road. For nearly 30 seconds, the mechanical noise became clearly audible on the recording. No headlights appeared. Nothing emerged from the darkness. Then the sound passed through the intersection and gradually faded toward the opposite ridge, even though there was no connecting road continuing in that direction. That recording became the strongest evidence collected during the entire investigation. Audio specialists confirmed that the microphone had captured a low-frequency mechanical sound rather than ordinary wind or insects. They could not identify the exact source. The recording contained characteristics consistent with an engine, but insufficient detail existed to determine what type. Investigators compared it with trucks, tractors, generators, mining machinery, and off-road vehicles. Some produced similar frequencies. None reproduced the complete sound recorded that morning. After August 26th, the valley became quiet again. September arrived without another report. Patrols gradually returned to normal, and residents stopped checking cameras every morning. The investigation was eventually closed without identifying a vehicle, driver, or source for the sound. No property had been damaged, nobody had been threatened, and nothing had been stolen. Officially, there was no crime to investigate. Years later, people who lived in the valley still disagree about what happened. Some believe machinery operating many miles away created an acoustic illusion amplified by the mountains. Others suspect someone had discovered a forgotten route through the timberland and deliberately traveled it after midnight. neither explanation accounts comfortably for everything investigators documented. The locked gate never appeared disturbed, cameras activated along an empty road, tire-like impressions appeared on a route considered impassable, and a deputy's microphone captured something moving toward an intersection without anything visible ever arriving. Older residents remembered one additional detail only after investigators began studying historical maps. Before the logging companies abandoned the mountain, trucks carrying timber had once used the forgotten route behind the church to reach the main highway. The road was closed permanently after a section collapsed during heavy flooding in the late 1970s. Several drivers who worked there were still alive when the investigation occurred, and they confirmed that loaded trucks often descended the mountain after midnight during busy summer seasons. The route described by those retired drivers matched almost exactly the direction followed by the unexplained sound decades later. Nobody suggested that old logging trucks were somehow still traveling through the valley. The historical connection proved nothing. Yet every August, when summer begins fading and the mountains become dark before the evening heat disappears, some longtime residents still remember those nights. They remember standing behind curtains and listening to something coming slowly down a road nobody could drive anymore. They remember motion lights turning on one after another while nothing crossed their yards. Most of all, they remember the final night when the sound reached the highway, past an officer waiting directly beside it, and continued toward a road that had never existed. Whatever moved through that valley was never identified. Perhaps the mountains distorted an ordinary sound in an extraordinary way. Perhaps an explanation existed somewhere among the forgotten logging roads investigators never fully explored. But for the families who lived there during those quiet August nights, the mystery was never about ghosts or legends. It was about hearing something approach night after night, knowing exactly where it should appear, and watching an empty road when it finally reached them. That was what happened during those August nights, and for the people who were there, it was never forgotten. In this new story, every July, millions of Americans leave home believing the most dangerous part of their vacation will be heavy traffic, bad weather, or a flat tire somewhere along an unfamiliar highway. Most return with photographs, souvenirs, and stories they'll happily tell for years. Others return with experiences they rarely mention, not because no one would believe them, but because they still cannot explain what happened. Over the last 4 decades, sheriff departments, state police agencies, and local newspapers across the United States have quietly documented dozens of unusual reports connected to July road trips. None were ever officially linked together. Different states, different highways, different families. Yet investigators reviewing the records years later noticed something unsettling. Every witness insisted their trip changed forever after making one decision they believed was completely ordinary. The first case began during the second week of July 2015. Robert and Lisa Campbell had spent nearly 6 months planning a 2-week road trip from Missouri to Yellowstone National Park. Both were recently retired school teachers who preferred scenic backroads over busy interstates. Their travel journal, recovered months later by relatives, documented nearly every stop along the journey, including restaurants, fuel receipts, hiking trails, and conversations with local residents. It would eventually become one of the most detailed records investigators had available. On July 10th, shortly after leaving eastern Wyoming, the couple stopped at a small family-owned diner where another customer suggested a little-known scenic highway that crossed hundreds of miles of open prairie before reconnecting with the interstate farther north. According to him, the drive offered spectacular sunsets and almost no traffic. Robert marked the route inside his paper atlas before thanking the man. Security footage later confirmed the conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. No one ever identified the traveler who recommended the road. The first 100 miles were exactly as promised. Endless grasslands stretched toward distant mountains, while the evening sun painted the horizon deep shades of orange and gold. Robert stopped several times to photograph abandoned barns, windmills, and grazing antelope. Lisa continued writing inside her travel journal, describing the highway as one of the quietest roads they had ever driven. Shortly before sunset, she noted something unusual. They had not passed another moving vehicle for nearly 40 minutes, despite traveling during the busiest vacation month of the year. Around 8:30, they reached a weathered service station standing alone beside the highway. Its fuel pumps had been removed years earlier, but the building itself appeared occupied. An elderly woman sweeping the front porch smiled and asked whether they were heading north. When Robert answered yes, she quietly suggested they continue driving until reaching the interstate without stopping again, regardless of what they might see along the road. Lisa later wrote the warning in her journal, adding that the woman refused to explain further before wishing them a safe trip. It seemed like an odd conversation, but neither considered it especially important at the time. Just after darkness settled across the prairie, Robert noticed headlights appearing several miles behind them. The vehicle never seemed to get closer, despite maintaining exactly the same speed for nearly 20 minutes. Whenever Robert slowed slightly, the distant headlights slowed as well. When he accelerated, they accelerated too. Curious, he eventually pulled onto the shoulder, expecting the other driver to pass. Instead, the headlights stopped almost half a mile away and remained perfectly still. After waiting several minutes, Robert returned to the highway. The distant lights resumed, following at exactly the same distance. They reached the interstate shortly before 10 and immediately noticed the headlights disappear. Relieved, they continued toward Billings without discussing the incident further. The following morning, while reviewing photographs from the previous evening, Lisa discovered something unexpected. One image captured during sunset clearly showed the highway stretching behind their vehicle for several miles. There were no headlights anywhere on the road. The timestamp matched the exact period when both insisted another vehicle had been following them. Photography specialists later confirmed the image showed no signs of digital alteration. The second case occurred 3 years later during July 2018 in northern Maine. Brothers Kevin and Thomas Riley planned a fishing trip near the Canadian border. Their route crossed long stretches of forest where gas stations became increasingly rare after sunset. Shortly after 9, they stopped at a lonely convenience store to buy coffee and ask about the quickest route to their rented cabin. The cashier looked toward the parking lot before asking whether they had seen an older green station wagon parked outside. Both brothers turned toward the windows. The parking lot contained only their pickup truck. When they answered no, the cashier quietly apologized and changed the subject. Less than an hour later, Kevin noticed an older green station wagon parked beside the highway with its hood raised. Assuming someone needed assistance, he slowed almost to a stop. Before either brother could open the doors, another pickup traveling in the opposite direction repeatedly flashed its headlights. The driver leaned out his window and shouted only 3 words, "Keep driving now." Kevin accelerated without hesitation. When they glanced back through the rear window, less than 30 seconds later, the station wagon had disappeared. The shoulder where it had been parked stretched empty beneath the moonlight. State police later confirmed no disabled vehicles were reported anywhere along that section of highway that evening. The final case came from southern West Virginia during July 2022. Emily Foster, a travel nurse from North Carolina, accepted a temporary assignment in Charleston and decided to spend several days exploring small Appalachian towns before beginning work. Unlike the previous witnesses, Emily carried a dashboard camera recording continuously throughout the trip. Shortly after entering an isolated mountain highway, she encountered a handwritten detour sign directing traffic away from ongoing bridge repairs. The route eventually led through a nearly abandoned coal community where every storefront appeared empty except one small grocery store still displaying fresh produce outside the entrance. Emily purchased bottled water, spoke briefly with the elderly owner, and continued driving. The receipt recovered from her wallet showed the purchase occurred at 4:23 that afternoon. 3 weeks later, curious about the unusual town, Emily attempted to revisit the grocery store while returning home. she never found it. Local residents insisted no grocery had operated there for nearly 15 years. Historical records later confirmed the building had been destroyed during a flood long before Emily claimed to have stopped there. Even more puzzling, the bottled water she purchased remained inside her vehicle, bearing the faded store label investigators could not match to any currently registered business in West Virginia. The receipt identified a tax registration number belonging to a company officially dissolved in 2016. No explanation accounted for how she obtained either item. Years later, a transportation researcher comparing unusual travel reports noticed an unexpected connection linking all three cases. None involved violence, none resulted in disappearances. Every traveler returned home safely, yet each witness received an unexplained warning from a stranger shortly before experiencing something investigators could never verify. The warnings differed only slightly. Keep driving, don't stop, stay on the highway, reach the interstate before dark. No official investigation ever determined why those warnings appeared so consistently across different states separated by thousands of miles. Perhaps they meant nothing at all. Or perhaps every July, somewhere along America's loneliest highways, ordinary travelers unknowingly pass through places where experienced locals understand one simple rule far better than any map ever could. In this new story, the Appalachian Mountains stretch for more than 2,000 miles across the eastern United States, passing through 14 states and thousands of small communities. Millions of people hike its trails every year without incident. Families camp beside its rivers, hunters disappear into its forests before sunrise, and retired couples spend quiet weekends driving its scenic roads. Yet, despite its popularity, there are stories that rarely appear in travel brochures or history books. They survive through sheriff reports, ranger journals, local newspapers, and conversations shared on front porches long after the sun goes down. Most of these stories are never presented as proof of anything supernatural. Instead, they are remembered because no investigation, no expert, and no witness has ever been able to explain exactly what happened. This is one of those stories. In the autumn of 2019, documentary photographer Aaron Mitchell accepted a commission from a regional history museum in North Carolina. His assignment was simple: spend 3 weeks traveling through the Appalachian Mountains, photographing abandoned schools, churches, railroad depots, and coal camps before time erased them completely. Aaron was 45 years old, meticulous, and unusually patient. He preferred working alone, often waiting hours for the right natural light before taking a single photograph. His reputation depended on accuracy, and he never embellished his experiences to make a story more interesting. Friends often joked that Aaron could spend an entire day documenting an empty building without speaking to another person. That quiet personality made what happened during his assignment even more difficult to dismiss. His journey began without incident. During the first week, he photographed abandoned mining communities across southwest Virginia before crossing into eastern Tennessee. Every evening, he uploaded his photographs, backed up his equipment, and wrote detailed notes describing each location. Those journals would later become one of the most important parts of the investigation because they documented exactly where he traveled, who he interviewed, and what he experienced each day. Nothing unusual appeared until the afternoon of October 14th, when he stopped at a nearly forgotten mountain church outside a community that no longer appeared on most modern maps. The church had been built during the early 1900s and officially closed more than 20 years earlier after the congregation became too small to maintain the property. Local volunteers still cut the grass several times each summer, but the building remained locked except during occasional historical tours. Aaron spent nearly 2 hours photographing weathered wooden pews, stained glass windows, and handwritten hymn books left inside glass display cases. Before leaving, he met an elderly volunteer named Charles Morgan, who had cared for the property for more than 15 years. Their conversation focused mainly on local history, until Charles unexpectedly asked whether Aaron planned to continue driving after sunset. Aaron answered that he hoped to reach another abandoned school nearly 40 miles away before spending the night in a nearby motel. Charles paused before quietly replying, "If you're still in the mountains after dark, don't follow lights that weren't there during the day." Aaron assumed the comment referred to hunters or private property and thanked the man before continuing east. By late afternoon, clouds settled across the ridges while temperatures dropped quickly. Shortly after 7, darkness covered the mountain roads completely. Traffic became almost non-existent, leaving Aaron alone with little more than the sound of tires against damp pavement. Around 8:15, while crossing a narrow ridge, he noticed a single light glowing through the trees several hundred yards above the highway. At first, he assumed it belonged to an isolated farmhouse. Less than a minute later, another light appeared farther along the same ridgeline. Then another. Within 5 minutes, 6 separate lights stretched across the mountainside. None moved, none flickered. They remained perfectly steady despite there being no visible roads or buildings nearby. Aaron stopped at a gravel turnout to photograph the unusual sight. Through the camera's viewfinder, the lights appeared unusually bright against the dark forest. He adjusted focus several times but could not identify their source. They looked too small to be houses and too steady to be flashlights. After taking several photographs, he climbed back into his vehicle and continued driving. Less than 10 minutes later, he rounded another bend and saw the exact same line of lights again, now appearing on a different mountain entirely. He checked his navigation screen to confirm he had continued east without turning around. The map showed no intersections capable of returning him to the previous overlook. Yet the pattern of lights looked identical, right down to their spacing across the ridge. The following morning, Aaron reviewed the photographs over breakfast, expecting to identify distant cabins hidden by darkness. Instead, every image showed an empty mountainside. The trees, ridges, and night sky appeared exactly as he remembered, but the lights themselves were missing. Thinking the camera had malfunctioned, he compared the digital timestamps. They confirmed the photographs had been taken during the exact period he remembered stopping beside the highway. Even stranger, his handwritten journal contained a sketch of the lights drawn immediately afterward while the memory remained fresh. Aaron rarely sketched anything unless he believed it might help identify a location later. Rather than dismissing the incident, Aaron returned to the same overlook the following evening under nearly identical weather conditions. He waited almost 3 hours. The lights never appeared. During the drive back, he stopped at a small diner where several longtime residents gathered each night after work. Curious, he casually mentioned seeing unexplained lights on the mountain. The conversation around him stopped almost immediately. Finally, an older woman seated near the window asked him a question. "Were they all in a straight line?" Aaron nodded. Without another word, the woman finished her coffee and quietly left the diner. No one laughed, no one offered an explanation. Instead, the owner walked over and changed the subject entirely, asking Aaron where he planned to travel next. Only after the other customers had gone did the owner explain why everyone became uncomfortable. Similar reports had circulated locally for generations. Hunters, utility workers, volunteer firefighters, and even state forestry employees occasionally described rows of steady lights appearing where no structures existed. Search teams sent to investigate never found electrical equipment, campsites, or evidence anyone had been on the ridges at all. Aaron spent the next several days researching county archives instead of photographing abandoned buildings. Inside a historical society office, he discovered newspaper clippings dating back to the 1950s describing unidentified mountain lights observed by unrelated witnesses across different decades. None of the reports claimed anything supernatural. Most suggested atmospheric conditions, distant vehicles, or optical illusions. Yet each investigation reached the same conclusion. No explanation fully matched the observations because the lights often appeared where roads had never existed. One forestry report even noted that helicopters flown over the reported locations during daylight found nothing but dense, untouched forest. When Aaron returned home, he organized the material into a presentation for the museum that had hired him. To the surprise of his colleagues, he removed every reference to the lights before the exhibit opened. Later, one curator asked why he excluded what seemed like the most interesting part of the assignment. Aaron's answer was simple. The photographs couldn't prove what I saw. The witnesses couldn't prove what they remembered. But none of us could explain it either. Years have passed since Aaron's journey through the Appalachians. The museum still displays his photographs of abandoned churches, forgotten schools, and empty coal towns. Visitors admire the images without realizing one chapter of the trip was intentionally left out. Somewhere among those mountains are ridges where experienced hunters refuse to chase distant lights after sunset, not because they believe every story they have heard, but because too many ordinary people with nothing to gain by inventing them, have described the same impossible sight for more than half a century. Perhaps there is a perfectly ordinary explanation waiting to be discovered. Or perhaps the Appalachian Mountains still keep a few stories that no one has ever been able to explain. In this news story, most ghost stories are impossible to verify because they survive only through rumor, family tradition, or stories repeated over generations. Investigators rarely pay attention to those accounts because they usually contain little evidence beyond personal belief. Every so often, however, an incident emerges that attracts the attention of law enforcement, emergency responders, and independent witnesses at the same time. Those cases are remembered not because anyone proved the existence of ghosts, but because every documented fact resisted ordinary explanation. One of the most discussed incidents of that kind began during the autumn of 2016 inside an abandoned elementary school hidden among the hills of eastern Kentucky. What started as a routine trespassing complaint eventually became a case that local investigators still remember years later. The Red Hollow Elementary School had been closed for nearly 14 years after declining enrollment forced the district to consolidate several rural campuses. Since then, the building had remained empty while ownership slowly transferred between county agencies. Electricity, water, and heating systems had all been disconnected, leaving the school exposed to years of harsh Appalachian winters. Although occasional vandals broke windows or painted graffiti inside the gymnasium, deputies rarely considered the property a significant concern. The building sat nearly 2 miles from the nearest occupied home, hidden behind thick woods that discouraged casual visitors. Most local residents eventually forgot the school still existed until several unrelated reports began arriving within the same month. The first report came from 2 utility contractors inspecting damaged telephone lines after a powerful windstorm. While driving past the abandoned school shortly after sunrise, both men noticed lights glowing inside what had once been the second-floor library. Assuming renovation crews had entered the building without notifying the utility company, they continued their inspection before mentioning the observation to county dispatch later that afternoon. Records immediately confirmed that no maintenance work had been scheduled anywhere on the property. Deputies briefly inspected the exterior before finding every entrance secured with rusted chains, exactly as documented during the previous county inspection only 3 weeks earlier. Several nights later, the County Volunteer Fire Department received an emergency call reporting possible smoke coming from the school roof. Firefighters arrived expecting an electrical fire despite knowing the building had no active power service. Upon reaching the property, they discovered no flames, no smoke, and no heat anywhere inside the structure. Thermal imaging cameras detected only normal temperature differences caused by cooling, concrete, and broken windows exposed to the night air. Before leaving, however, one firefighter quietly mentioned noticing what appeared to be movement at the far end of an upstairs hallway while searching the building. Other crew members dismissed the observation as shifting flashlight reflections, and the incident received little additional attention. The investigation changed during the second week of October when a deputy sheriff conducting routine patrol noticed something unusual while driving along the county highway below the hillside. Through gaps in the trees, he briefly observed several classroom windows reflecting a warm yellow glow, unlike ordinary sunrise or vehicle headlights. Curious, after hearing earlier reports, he drove directly to the property. By the time he reached the parking lot, less than 4 minutes later, every window had returned to complete darkness. The deputy searched the entire building alone before requesting additional officers. Dust covered every classroom floor, fallen ceiling tiles blocked several hallways, and years of accumulated debris remained completely undisturbed. There was no indication that another person had entered the school. Because multiple independent witnesses had now reported similar observations, detectives requested permission to install surveillance equipment throughout the building. Motion-activated cameras monitored every exterior entrance, while additional units covered the central staircase, library, gymnasium, and second-floor hallway where unusual activity had reportedly been observed. Audio recorders capable of operating continuously for several weeks were also placed inside the building to capture any sounds occurring overnight. Investigators expected the equipment to identify trespassers within days. Instead, nearly a month of recordings produced an entirely different puzzle. No unauthorized person was ever recorded entering or leaving the school. Even so, dispatch continued receiving occasional reports describing lights visible inside upper classroom windows before dawn. When technicians reviewed the surveillance recordings, they found nothing unusual on the video itself. Hallways remained empty, classrooms stayed dark, and exterior cameras showed no activity beyond wildlife crossing the parking lot. The audio recordings, however, attracted immediate attention. On 5 separate nights, microphones placed inside different sections of the school simultaneously captured faint sounds resembling lockers closing somewhere along the second-floor corridor. The sounds lasted only a few seconds before complete silence returned. Structural engineers later analyzed the recordings, suggesting that cooling metal pipes, loose ventilation ducts, or settling roof supports might produce similar noises. Yet none of those explanations accounted for the remarkable consistency in timing and location across every recording. Seeking a practical explanation, investigators invited engineers specializing in abandoned structures to examine the school from foundation to roof. Every electrical conduit, maintenance tunnel, attic space, and basement storage room was carefully inspected. Specialists searched for hidden occupants, illegal electrical connections, battery-powered lighting, or evidence that someone had secretly lived inside the building. They discovered nothing beyond expected storm damage and years of gradual deterioration. Even the upstairs library, where witnesses consistently reported seeing lights, contained only empty shelves, broken furniture, and shattered windows overlooking the surrounding forest. No hidden equipment capable of producing the reported glow was ever found. As detectives expanded their investigation, county archives revealed something unexpected. Maintenance records from the early 1980s documented several complaints filed by evening custodians describing unexplained lights appearing inside empty classrooms after electrical circuits had been switched off during renovation work. At the time, supervisors concluded faulty wiring probably caused the reports, although electricians later found no defects requiring repair. The records contained only brief references and were forgotten for decades until investigators compared them with the current witness statements. Although separated by more than 30 years, both groups consistently identified the same section of the second floor overlooking the eastern hillside. The school remained under periodic observation throughout the winter, but reports gradually became less frequent before stopping altogether after the county approved demolition the following summer. Contractors dismantled the aging structure over several weeks while investigators remained on site, hoping demolition might expose concealed rooms, hidden access points, or forgotten electrical equipment overlooked during previous inspections. None was discovered. Once the final walls disappeared and the property was cleared, every report connected to the abandoned school came to an end. No similar observations have been documented there since. Today, the official investigation remains archived as an unresolved suspicious incident rather than a criminal case. Detectives involved have repeatedly emphasized that nothing uncovered during the inquiry proved the presence of ghosts or any other supernatural cause. Nevertheless, they also acknowledge that several important questions remain unanswered. Independent witnesses reported nearly identical observations without knowing one another. Emergency responders personally experienced unusual events while searching the building. Surveillance equipment failed to identify trespassers despite weeks of monitoring. Engineers eliminated every practical explanation they could reproduce. In the end, the case became memorable not because anyone proved a haunting had occurred, but because every reasonable explanation quietly disappeared long before the questions did. For those who worked the investigation, it remains one of the true ghost encounters that no one involved has ever completely forgotten.